Okay, today we're going to replace out the trigger out of one of the Canik Mete lines of pistols. This is a Mete SF, but it'd be the same on the SF, the SFT, the SFX, the Pro models. It'd all be the same. Any of the Mete line of pistols will work exactly this way. The Metes are much easier to work on than the TP9s were. They've greatly simplified how these pistols tear down. The first thing we do is obviously make sure we're unloaded, we're safe. We're going to press our trigger, slightly pull back, take your slide off just like you do when you're cleaning. Nothing special there. We're actually taking out a Freedom Smith trigger here, which I decided I don't care for. And I have a Canik flat face coming for this, which I don't have yet. So I'm actually going to put the factory trigger back in here until I get the new Canik flat face trigger, and we're going to go from there. So you only need a few tools. You need either an armor's block, which you can get on Amazon for $5 or $6, or you could also just use a roll of duct tape or something. You just need something with holes. We've got to knock some of these pins out, and these armor box greatly help, especially when you're working with your trigger bar, working off of the gaps they have with the holes up top. But we'll get to that. So taking down these are not very hard. It's greatly simplified. You don't need a lot of tools. You need your Canik tool that the gun came with, which does most of the work. You need a 5/64 roll pin punch, and a roll pin punch, they have the little dimple on the tip to help guide it. You need that to take the trigger shoe off the trigger bar, and you may need a hammer, especially if the pistol's never been taken apart. The pins are a little bit harder to move the first time. After that, it's greatly simplified. And then I also use a little hook. This is just one of them Harbor Freight tools to work this spring off. So that's the first thing I do. Down inside of here, you have your spring that keeps your slide lock down. We just need to take that out of place. And just pry it up and get that out of the way. And you don't have to have one of these tools. You could use just a straight screwdriver. All you're trying to do is get that pin off of the ledge that it rides on, and just leave that spring hang down. We'll get it out later. And then we've got a series of pins up here to take out. We're going to start with the slide lock, which comes out pretty simple using the tool from Canik. There's a dimple right on the side of the pin on the right side of the pistol, and we're just going to give that a tap. It won't take much. She starts to go. You can see it's starting to move out the lock on this side. We're going to get that out. Once you get that moving, the lock on this side, to remove it, you just slide it up and out. There's a keyway molded into the polymer frame that locks this guy in place. Much improved. The TP9 used to have a drift pin you used to have to knock out that was a bear. This is a much better, easier design. And we can just pull out the pin on the other side, wiggle, 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 get it all the way out, set that aside. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take out the bar that you use to take the slide off. You have to be careful. There's a lock in the center there. You can see it moving with the bar. That's spring loaded. So as you take this pin out, you've got to keep your thumb up here so it doesn't shoot out. There's a spring and there's a detent in here. You don't want to lose those pieces. You got to keep those. Since I've had this apart before, this usually moves pretty simple. I didn't even need the hammer. On the bar on the opposite side, it just rides in a slot molded into the pistol itself. So you can take that out, put it aside. Now I'm going to put my thumb on the top to maintain that, and I'm going to finish pulling the pin out from the other side and set that aside. And I'm just letting the tension off of that spring. And we're going to get this out so I don't lose it. There's the lock. There's 2 more pieces in here. There you go. The spring and the detent that ride in the lock. So I'm going to put that back in there. When we reassemble it, it goes back in just like that. Carefully set that aside. Those springs are easy to lose. So now we've got 1 more pin up front that locks in the front locking block. It usually comes out pretty simple too. There we go. Just pulls out. That pin's out. Now at this point we can raise the locking block, and then we got to pay attention to that spring that we unloaded before. Once this locking block comes out, the spring will fall free. I'm just going to pry that up easy. Take the locking block out, and so we don't lose it, we're going to come back and catch this spring. It only sits in a hole in the side of the frame right there, and then it rides on this ledge. So we're just taking that spring out for now so we don't lose it. Now all we have to do is come to the rear of the pistol and knock out this pin that locks the trigger pack in. At this point, the trigger and the trigger bar is free. The only thing left holding is that rear pin. Give it a tap. These usually come out pretty good. This is where it's handy to have a block with a hole because it catches your pin for you. If you don't have a block, like I said, you can use a roll of duct tape, or you can even just take a piece of wood and drill a hole down in it and do the same thing. But I work on enough guns. I think I paid $8 for that. No big deal. Set that aside. Now our trigger pack in the rear will come out. Usually pretty simple. I don't even need a tool. You may, first time, may have to come underneath and slightly pry up, maybe. These trigger packs can be a pain to take apart and put back together, so I recommend you do not take the trigger pack apart. So I'm going to kind of carefully pull this out. I'm lifting up on the trigger pack in the rear. I'm holding onto the bar with it, and there's the trigger, comes right out. So now the trigger bar is attached to the spring back here. So all we have to do is take the trigger bar off of that spring. Comes off real easy. Now I'm going to set the trigger pack aside carefully. I don't want to mess with that trigger pack. They're kind of a pain. I'd rather not mess with it. Now this comes, we're going to set our frame aside. We don't need that for a little bit. Now we have to take the trigger bar off of the trigger shoe. This is probably the hardest part of this whole job. But not much we can do about that. This is where you're going to need that 5/64 roll pin punch. And what I do is use the cutout in my armor's block with the hole up here. And we're going to tap this pin through here. You don't want to drive this pin all the way out. You're only going to drive it through enough to release the trigger bar. You can see on this factory one how the pin's still there. So we're just going to tap this a little bit and check. And it moves pretty easy. I can feel it moving every time I tapped it. Okay, I got to go a little bit more. You can see the pin coming out there. There you go. Trigger bar came out. Pin is still in place. So this is now, we're going to set this aside. We're done with this. Do not knock that pin all the way out. There's no need to. That pin also has your safety dingus rides on that same pin. If you take that pin out, then you'll lose the safety dingus and possibly that spring in there. So no reason to. It only has to come out enough to release the pin. Set that trigger aside. We're going to go to our new trigger. Now we have to think which way this bar goes on here. The curve of the trigger bar goes to the think about pulling your trigger in your frame. So we're looking at the right side of the frame is where that trigger bar rides, and it bows towards the outside of the pistol. You can see it's like a bowed bar. So that's how you know where that trigger bar rides on here. On the factory, there's 2 pins. On the Freedom Smith, there's only 1. On the factory, you have 2 pins. You're always going to be working with that bottom pin. Leave that top pin alone. You don't want to touch that. So now we've got to drive that pin through this bar to put it back together. And this, getting this started, is kind of a pain in the neck. And this is where I'm putting the bow down into the cutaway of my armor's block, and I'm going to work that pin back in place. And usually I got to take a couple of shots at this because that trigger bar is going to move on me. Give it a love tap. I felt it move. I haven't grabbed it yet. I like kind of getting it to a spot where I can feel the pin. I'm not quite there yet. I'm looking through the hole and lining up the holes. We'll give it another tap there. The 564 roll pin punch moved quite a bit that time, so hopefully we got it captive. Nope, not yet. Felt like it bit that time. It's almost there. Once you get the pin to actually go through the hole in the trigger bar, you're home free. Then you can just set the pin at will. I haven't quite got it yet, but almost. Okay, now what's happened is it slipped out on me, and the pin is now too far through, and I can't get back on it. So I actually got to move this pin back a little bit. There's a sweet spot there, if you can catch it, where the pin is sticking out enough to actually bite on the bar for you. And I'm not there yet, so I got to push that pin back through just a little bit more. So this is probably the hardest part of this whole job, getting this shoe switched out. So I'll try to put a little pressure and kind of force it on that pin if I can. Not ready yet. Knock this pin out a little farther. Patience works for you here. Don't try and rush this. Wow, I went way past where it needs to be. I'm not moving that pin a whole lot when I'm tapping here. I'm just moving a little bit. Now there, I'm to the point where I can force it onto the pin now. So the pin is just slightly holding that trigger bar in there. Now it should hold it for me enough to get that pin past and into the hole. This is where, if you're trying to use a standard flat punch as opposed to a roll pin punch, it slips and wants to fall all over the place for you. The roll pin punch with that dimple holds it centered for you. I've got a good bite on there. Now I can just seat my pin and just kind of center it up. Now all I want to do is just look at it from side to side and kind of center that pin up like that, where it's kind of equal amounts on both sides. Now we've got our trigger shoe locked back onto our trigger bar. Now we're going to carefully get our trigger pack. We need to get the bar, that hook of the bar, back onto that spring down in there. So I'm going to push that on there. Sometimes you'll have to fiddle with this a time or two. There you go. That's how you want it. And make sure your spring sits in a guide up here, like so. So now you can see the spring is on the guide in the front, on the rod in the rear. Now I'm going to kind of hold tension there. Got my frame now. Now I want to reverse how I took this out. So I'm going to feed my trigger down into the opening in the frame, and then I'm going to guide the trigger pack back in and get this trigger pack seated. Sometimes your trigger itself can bind you up here, but Just gotta get that trigger pack reseated. There she goes. She snapped in. Now you can see the trigger pack is fully seated in there, and the triggers, of course, it's wobbly because it doesn't have its axle yet. But now we're going to right away reinstall this rear pin to lock that trigger pack in place, so we don't have to worry about it. That goes in pretty easy. You can just set it flat down, and you're going to take your pin and tap her in there. She goes in pretty easy. See, she started popping out on me again. Once you got your trigger pack all the way in, she goes in pretty easy. Back to my Canik tool in the dimple. Set the pin side to side. Good to go. Okay, now you won't need the 564 roll pin punch anymore. Now everything else will be done with mainly the Canik tool. Okay, so now we have to kind of reverse order things here. Got our trigger setting in place where it should be. Now, this isn't 100% exact order, but what I usually like to do at this point is get the left side of my slide stop in here, because that's also the axle for the trigger. So I'll slide that. Well, actually I'm lying, because we have to have our block in there too. So I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get our, we have to put the spring back on. It goes into the side. There's a little hole right there. Drop that in there. And you see that this is bent to the exact shape of the frame there. So we'll drop that spring in there. And then we'll take our block, drop our block in. May have to wiggle the trigger a little bit. There she goes. She dropped right in. If you have to, you can coax it a little bit. Just try not to force too much. And that locks in that spring now. It can't come out because it's underneath of the block. Now we can take and put our slide stop through on the left, because now it's going through the block and the trigger. And you got to kind of come into where it touches and stop, because we got to put the other side on to match it. We got to come back up to 90 degrees to get it to go into its keyway. And then hinge it down into place. Now it can't come out unless it's up at 90 degrees. So that's how you lock that back in. And then we can push the other side in to meet it. And it just goes right back in. Now we're all connected into one. And we can even reach in here and reattach our spring. You just want the spring on top of the slide lock. That's your spring for the slide lock. Now that guy's in place. Now we've got a couple things left here we have to install. We've got to get our takedown bar in place, and we've got to get our bar in that locks the front block in place. We're going to put that guy in first. This has a I don't know what you want to call it, a little spacer piece sticking out on one end, and you can see that in the frame it's molded for it. You put that guy in there and just line it up with the oval shape there, push it all the way in. That's it. That's all that guy does. It sits right there. Now this is where we got to be careful. We have to reinstall our lock. Remember, we've got the spring and the detent up inside of this. And then it matters what direction this goes. You see that it's flat on the rear and tapered on the front. The taper goes towards the front of the pistol. And when you put this down in here, you have to make sure the spring stays straight. So we're going to drop this guy in here like so. And you see we're spring loaded there. And sometimes this pin, the bar can be a little tricky, because the hole also has to go through and catch the detent up top. So we're going to start it in there. And this is just kind of like a wiggle, wiggle, wiggle until you get that dude in there. There you go. So all I did was push down the detent to start that across. Now I have to take the opposite side bar, and you'll notice the hole is not centered. So it needs to be offset towards the top, and drop that into the slot on the side of the frame. It just rides in there, and then finish pushing that across, and you can see that pin went right into it. So now you have, sometimes if you don't have that spring right in there, which I don't think I do, that spring has a hole in the bottom, and if it gets bound up in there, you can't push down, which is exactly what's happening. So we need to back this dude out and fix that spring. I'm gonna pull this out a little bit and get that out, set it aside. I'm put my thumb back on top to catch that so it doesn't spring out on me. And now I need to check this spring. That spring has to be straight. If it's crooked in there, it won't allow that detent to spring up and down as it needs to be. There it is. The spring and the detent fell out for me. The first time I put this gun back together, I crushed the spring a little bit. You can see it's got a little bend in it, so that doesn't help matters. I'll put the detent back in the spring. I'll put the detent and the spring up into here. I'm going to work this back down into here. Got the taper towards the front, the flat towards the back. That feels pretty good. I'm going to slide this back in here. Sometimes you got to be careful. This is the point when it's easy to launch this detent across the room on you. You forget your thumb up top and pull this out, and she'll spring across the room. And then you're going to be calling Canik and ordering parts, which really sucks. If this is giving you trouble, you can take a standard roll pin and come in from the other side and try and hold things in place until you can get this pin started. Of course, first time she went right in there. Now she's going to fight me. I think she's starting to move a little bit. Some of these times it seems like you need to have a couple of hands to do this. I'm still trying to keep my finger up here. I'm going to see if I can give this a love tap. Get this baby moving. There she went. Okay. Now I made the mistake of pushing all the way through, so I'm going to push this pin back just enough so I can slide the opposite side on, hole towards the top. The offset hole towards the top. Slide that back in the slot. There she is. She's locked in. The only thing that holds that guy in is the molding in the frame and the pin that goes through it. So you want to make sure that this bar moves, or you'll have trouble getting your slide off. I think we've got it this time. Now you've got your lower frame completely assembled. This is back to factory trigger. So now we can take our slide, line up our cuts with our rails. Now we're back to factory trigger until I get my Canik flat face. All I'm doing now is safety checking, make sure everything works. The other thing I want to make sure is I can get the slide off. So that means I got that spring on the detent correctly, so I can take the slide off. there you go. That's how you replace a Canik trigger in the Mete line of pistols. Any of the Metes will work like this.